Thank you. It's wonderful to be here and to have a chance to share and connect what I've been talking about in the context of the corruption of our government to the form of the question presented by this series, the question of public goods. But I want to begin with two sacred texts which frame what I want to offer you today. So the first, there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil. Henry David Thoreau, 1846, on Walden. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. Let's call that a root striker. And the second sacred text, this little snippet. Any king, prince, or foreign state. 1787, Philadelphia, the Constitution, Article 1, Section 9 says, "And no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of the Congress, accept any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state." Now that little snippet was inspired by a tiny scandal involving this great American, Franklin. While he was serving in France, he received a gift from Louis XVI, a snuff box with his portrait, diamonds studding the portrait. He wasn't the only one to receive a gift like that. Arthur Lee, before him, had received a similar gift, and the King of Spain was in the practice of giving similar gifts to ambassadors serving in Spain. And what the founders feared by this practice of gift-giving was officers developing an improper dependency, an improper perspective as they were distracted by the offer or expectation of these future gifts. And so to avoid that, this clause was added for the purpose of establishing independence in these officers. Okay, that's the sacred text. Here's the argument. So as you heard, I published this book. I'm really proud of the poetic title. People don't know what it means, but I explain it's Republic, comma, lost. Doesn't seem to help. Okay, so that's why the publisher was insistent that we have the subtitle to make things clear here. This is a book about how money corrupts Congress, and it's a book to offer a plan to stop it. So let's take each of these in part. Let's start with how does money corrupt Congress here? To do this, I need to do a little brainwashing to bring you to the perspective I want you to occupy as you think about this particular problem, and I'll brainwash you through a series of examples. The first around copyright. October 27th, 1998, I became a copyright activist when President Clinton signed into law a statute honoring this great American, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act. The statute which did, among other things, extend the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. Existing copyrights. And the question Congress was to ask when it passed that statute was, did that advance the public good? To extend the term of an existing copyright. Now, copyrights, of course, are essential to create the incentives for many authors and artists to create great new works. But the one thing we know about incentives is that they are prospective only. Not even the United States Congress can get George Gershwin to do anything more. So when you ask the question, could it make sense to extend the term of an existing copyright? Obviously, it couldn't make public good sense because it's only about advancing the private interest of the current copyright holder, not about creating new incentives. And so obvious was this, that when we attacked the statute in the Supreme Court and had a brief signed by 13 economists, including 6 Nobel Prize winners, including this liberal this is Milton Friedman, right-wing Nobel Prize winner. Friedman said he would join the brief only if the word no-brainer was somewhere in the brief. So obvious was it that you couldn't advance the public good by extending the term of existing copyright. But apparently there were no brains in this place when Congress unanimously extended the term of these existing copyrights. What there was more than $6 million from the Disney Corporation and related corporations arguing for the extension of terms that would benefit them, the public good, be damned. Or while we're on it, let's think of another IP example. I'm sure many of you have tripped upon this page today on the internet. Wikipedia joining a large number of other internet sites in a day of protest, protesting Congress's expected passage of, whether it's SOPA or PIPA, a statute designed to advance the fight against, quote, piracy. So what exactly is Congress thinking when it thinks about enacting this statute? Well, here's the Stop Online Piracy Act. It tells us directly what it's trying to do here. This is exactly what it's trying to do. It's trying to promote prosperity, creativity, entrepreneurship, and innovation by combating the theft of US property and for other purposes. And it intends to do all these wonderful things by giving federal courts the power to shut down, turn off the DNS register for any site held to, quote, engage in, enable, or facilitate copyright infringement. Now, the first of those is a little bit obvious. Okay, engage in copyright infringement, we get that. But when you think about those sites that enable or facilitate copyright infringement, you begin to recognize what this is describing is basically the whole internet. Because, of course, all sites on the internet, in the architecture of the original design of the internet, in some sense are enabling or making easier the acts of copyright infringement, leaving open the question of what exactly is the scope of this regulation. And secondly, how do you go about getting a website or a domain name shut down? And basically, all you do is you go in and ask, because there's no hearing that allows the other side to come in and rebut what you claim or to prove anything to the contrary. No due process here at all, leading many to say, isn't this just a prior restraint? My colleague Lawrence Tribe at Harvard wrote a very strong criticism of the proposed bill, saying, yeah, in fact, it is a prior restraint, leading many to think, well, don't we have a First Amendment to stop such prior restraints? Leading to the response from the other side, haven't you heard there's a copyright exception to the First Amendment? Never has the First Amendment yet been held to restrict the scope of what copyright laws can do. And when you put all of this together, it's really quite extraordinary what this statute is trying to achieve. And it has led many in the technology community to say, rather than promoting innovation, because of the uncertainty and insecurity such regulation is going to bring to the internet, it may in fact kill off extraordinary innovation. And to these people then, they can concede, yes, of course, this is combating the theft of US property, not through these means, however. So then what exactly is it about? Well, this brings us back to this other clause. What's the statute about? I haven't a clue. I don't know why they think this statute makes sense. But here's what I do know. MapLight, fantastic organization tracking the relationship between money and policy decisions, has published a study that shows that if you are a member of Congress who has supported this statute, you get 13 times as much money from the people who are supporting the statute than if you are a person who is opposing this statute. Okay, here's another example. Let's call this IP3. Statute introduced last month by Darrell Issa, a Republican from California, and Carolyn Maloney, a Democrat from New York, called the Research Works Act. The statute's in response to a policy of the NIH. The NIH, 2 years ago, adopted a rule that said all NIH-funded research must be available for a free download 12 months after it's been published. Just free download. It doesn't have to be licensed freely, it just has to be freely accessible. Of course, the idea of free here is a little bit weird. Free, but of course, we already paid for that research. That's the whole point, right? We, the people, give our money to the Treasury gives the money to the NIH, And the NIH then pays for research, which under this statute, or this rule, we get for free, having paid for it. We get it for free, in that sense of free. Now, some people don't like this regime, in particular publishers, in particular Elsevier doesn't like this regime, because Elsevier, as a publisher of many scientific journals, is enjoying an extraordinary explosion in profits because of the opportunity they've had to radically increase the price of scientific journals over time, because scientific journals turn out to be the sort of things universities cannot say no to, at least rich universities can't say no to, and they don't like any rule that forces the research we've paid for to be accessible for free. So they got their friends Issa and Maloney to introduce this bill. This bill effectively bans any open access requirement by NIH or any other government entity for government-funded publications. The government cannot require government-funded research be made available in this free way going forward. Why? Well, Carolyn Maloney said the reason is this bill would save jobs. You know, there's like a standard cut and paste for all bills. This is like number one, it would save jobs. The economic theory behind this is a little bit obscure. The idea here, if you increase taxes, you get more jobs, right? Because we've paid for this once, and the idea is if we pay for it twice, somehow more jobs will be produced in America. I don't get the economics, but she apparently does. The other thing she says is it advances the public interest in the important peer review publishing system. Her staffer didn't quite realize that peer review, of course, is free. Nobody gets paid for peer review, so you don't need to be paying people to engage in this act of peer review. So then what does, in fact, explain this statute? I haven't a clue. Haven't a clue. Here's what I know. Maplight says, if you support the statute, you get 6.1 times as much money as if you oppose the statute. And indeed, Carolyn Maloney has received 40% of the contributions from Elsevier and Elsevier executives. 40% of their contributions have gone to this one representative from New York. Here's another IP example. Not intellectual property, let's talk about Internet Protocol IP in the sense of broadband. You probably know this, but let's just be clear. It's a technical term. Broadband in the United States sucks. Sucks. You could look at any number of OECD studies, and they'd all look something like this. The United States always falls way down the tail, fighting with countries like Spain and Portugal for our standing in the world's broadband penetration and access across the country. And the challenge in America is whether broadband is going to look like this in the future or just something like this, twisted copper pairs that continue to deliver terrible broadband. Now, some states are trying to do something about this. North Carolina, in particular, a state which has the worst broadband of any state in the nation. North Carolina is trying to spur more growth of broadband in their country, in their state. So local communities have begun to adopt what's called a community broadband strategy, which means the local communities fund the development of broadband companies that provide fiber to local businesses and to local citizens at a much cheaper cost than Time Warner or Comcast do. So here's a slide that shows what happened in North Carolina. These bubbles represent what these community broadband providers were offering. So this is upstream speeds and downstream speeds. The best of these, offered by Fibrant, was giving 55 megabits upstream, 55 megabits downstream. Symmetrical fiber to the house for about $85 a month. That's the same price that Time Warner was charging for just the same amount of downstream, but almost 1 or 2 megabits upstream. So the basic point this graph is trying to tell you, it's a community center, I know graphs are a little bit scary for me too, but you know, we have to get over it here. This graph is telling you something very simple. These community broadband providers were providing extraordinarily powerful, cheap service relative to what Time Warner and AT&T were providing. Time Warner and AT&T didn't like this competition. They got members of the North Carolina legislature to introduce what's called House Bill 129 last year, passed and signed by a Democratic governor, This bill says community broadband in the state of North Carolina is banned. Communities are not free to set up broadband that competes with private broadband, not free to try to bring North Carolina into the 21st century. Why? I haven't got a clue. I haven't got a clue. Here's what we do know. Endless campaign funds into the Republican legislature inspired this bill, and the fear of retaliation against the governor led her not to veto this bill. Okay, let's get a little away from IP. Let's go to Wall Street. Of course, we've just seen a collapse on Wall Street, 2008, that led to a collapse in the economy of the United States and around the world. What explains this collapse? Well, lots of theories. My favorite here is to follow the work of Johnson and Quack in this book, 13 Bankers, that describes this perverse mix that they said led to this collapse. A perverse mix of both too little government and too much government. Too little government in the sense of deregulation. The 1990s had seen this explosion of financial innovations, aka derivatives. But these innovations were effectively invisible to the market because of a series of regulatory changes adopted by Congress and the regulators that made it so derivatives did not have to be traded subject to the sort of rules that governed bonds and stocks, meaning traded on a public exchange, transparently, subject to anti-fraud requirements. So my colleague Frank Partner calculates in 1980, 98% of assets traded in our markets were traded on these public exchanges subject to transparency requirements and anti-fraud obligations. But because of these changes in regulations, by 2008, 90% of the assets traded in our economy were traded off of public exchanges, no requirement of transparency, no obligation of anti-fraud burdens, leading to the shadow banking market, where nobody knew what was out there. Nobody could make markets run efficiently because they didn't know what was out there, which of course encouraged the bubble, which when it burst brought the economy down. But Quack and Johnson say that alone wasn't enough. In addition to that, we had too much government because through the 1990s, the government sent a clear beacon to the financial markets that there was, in effect, a government guarantee that when the bubble would burst, there would be a bailout on the other side, producing what is the dumbest form of socialism ever invented by man. We socialize the risk, but privatize the benefit. We pay the downside, they get the upside. Now, this is not a legal audience. I apologize, it's a technical legal term, but this is an insanely stupid way to run a financial system. What explains this stupidity? And all of that is before 2008. After 2008, we have the proverbial insult added to injury here in the context of what our Congress did. Because after 2008, after the worst crisis since the Depression, after those who studied this crisis concluded that in significant part it was caused by this series of misregulations. People from the left, Stiegler, people from the right, Richard Posner, concluding misregulation encouraged the craziness that led to this crisis. After the dean of deregulation, Alan Greenspan, Ayn Randian Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Federal Reserve, confessed in testimony to Congress that he had been mistaken in his belief that the banks would act in the public interest as opposed to their private interest. After all of that, Wall Street still had the power to blackmail Democrats and Republicans alike to basically giving them a get-out-of-jail-free card in the form of, quote, financial reform that didn't reform any of the fundamental structural flaws that led to the collapse in the first place. If banks were too big to fail in 2008, they are only too bigger to fail today. Now, what explains this craziness? I haven't got a clue. One thing I know, though, is the fastest growth in campaign contributions from 1990 until 2008 comes from the financial and security sectors, and in 2010, the largest sector contributing to candidates across the country was the financial services sector. Okay, one last example. I'm sure many of you, when you saw these images of the Deepwater Horizon, had this question in your head. How was it that such an experimental drilling platform could be permitted without extensive environmental impact and risk studies? I mean, after all, where I come from now, we spent about 9 years and 10,000 pages of environmental impact analysis to be able to build this green energy project in the Bay. So exactly how much analysis was done of this drilling platform before they were allowed to do their extraordinarily deep experimental drilling technology? The answer is 17 pages until they were exempted from any further environmental review. Now, when Congress heard about this, they were shocked.
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here. Oh, thank you very much. Everybody else.
Yet, of course, it was Congress that had required these fast-track approval processes. And why would Congress require fast-track approval in the context even of experimental technology? No one has a clue, but one thing we know is the endless campaign cash from the drilling companies driving to this particular end. Now, here's the point. No respectable liberal, libertarian, or conservative could defend these cases. Each of them is an abomination from each of these different political philosophy perspectives. So how is it they become part of fundamental policy decisions in our government? Political scientists are actually uncertain. Political science here is complex. But here's what I'm not uncertain about. After I've told you these stories, you believe you know what explains the craziness. All I have to do is point to the money, and you believe you have discovered a root cause. And my claim is, number one, it is because of cases like this that Americans in general believe, quote, money buys results in Congress. 75% of Americans believe money buys results in Congress. A little bit more Democrats than Republicans, but I guarantee you before the Republicans took over, it was just as many Republicans as Democrats. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here's the one thing we all agree upon. Money buys results in Congress. That leads to number two. That belief erodes trust in this institution. So last year, Gallup said it was 11% of the American public who has confidence in Congress. This year they said it's 12%. At the end of last year, though, the New York Times reported the number was 9%. You know, we should just put that in some context. If in 1974 we had run a poll in the Soviet Union and found that 15% of Soviet citizens believed in the Soviet government, we would have declared victory. We would have said it's all over. They have no confidence in their government. The government should not stand. But 9% of our citizens have confidence in our core democratic institution. It's certainly the case that at the time of the founding, there were more people who believed in the British Crown than who believe in our Congress today. Which leads to number three. This low trust erodes participation in the system. Rock the Vote, organization that registers and turns out young voters and turned out the largest number of young voters in the history of voting in 2008, found that in 2010 a significant number of their voters were not going to show up to vote. So they polled them. The number one answer by far, 2-to-1 over the second highest reason was, quote, no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. And it's not just kids who believe this. The vast majority of Americans who could have voted didn't vote in the last election, in part because of this belief. Why waste my time? It doesn't make sense unless I happen to be the person with the money. Okay, so here's the first point. The money erodes trust. It erodes trust in the institution. But is that all it does? Maybe the people are wrong to be mistrustful. Maybe they're just overly suspicious. Maybe they just need to trust the government a little bit more. Is that all it does? That leads to question number two. What, in fact, does it do beyond affect trust? And we can think about this question from two dimensions. Number one, substance. What evidence is there that it's actually changing what Congress does? And number two, agenda. What evidence is there that it affects the agenda of Congress? So in the area of substance, in fact, political scientists find something about this a little bit controversial. There's a debate, contest, about the extent to which we can show the relationship between contributions and results. Some people take this debate a little bit too far. I was on a radio show with Bradley Smith, who's the former chairman of the Federal Election Commission, and this is what he said on the show. The evidence is pretty overwhelming that the money does not play much of a role in what goes on in terms of legislative voting patterns and legislative behavior. The consensus about that among people who have studied it is roughly the same as the consensus among scientists that global warming is taking place. Now, to be clear, Brad Smith is not a global warming denier. He is a corruption denier. I was so astonished by this, I had to tweet it when he said it, and then I got in trouble for my hashtag, but that just means Brad Smith. That's all that stands for there. So here's the question, what is the evidence that we have results that are being driven by the money? There's an increasing range of statistical work that is establishing the statistical connection, at least in a significant number of congresses, between contributor influence and actually what Congress does. But I find the most interesting research, this work by Martin Guylands. Guylands looked at 1,781 public opinion surveys that measured attitudes. And then he tracked what actually happened to public policy. And he took those surveys, there were about 887 of them, where the attitudes of the richest 10% conflicted with the attitudes of the rest of America. So the question was, when 10% want to go left and 90% want to go right, which way did policy in America go, left or right? And what he found was that when Americans with different income levels differ in their policy preferences, actual policy outcomes strongly reflect the preferences of the most affluent, but bear virtually no relationship to the preferences of poor and middle-income Americans. Now, you might look at that and say, well, this vast discrepancy is explained by the fact that the richest Americans are the most educated. And as a professor, I wish that were true, but I'm sorry to report, it turns out the richest Americans are not the most educated. This is not just geniuses guiding public policy. This is public policy being driven by an influence that has nothing necessarily to do with insight and everything to do with financial wealth. Okay, that's in the context of substance, but more pronounced is in the context of the agenda. Because remember, Brad Smith said there's no evidence that it affects legislative behavior, and this is just flatly wrong. So if I asked you, what was the #1 issue Congress spent its time dealing with in the first 4 months of last year? Right, we're in the middle of 2 wars, huge unemployment problem, still lots to do with health care. There was a government shutdown threatened because of the debt ceiling, lots of really important issues out there. What was the issue they spent their time thinking about? The answer is the bank swipe fee controversy. Now you say to yourself, if you're a normal person, I hope, what the hell is the bank swipe fee controversy which dominated Congress's agenda? That's the question about when you swipe your debit cards, whether banks get more money or retailers have to pay less money. Simple transfer from one side to the other, regulated by federal regulation. So swipe fees was Congress's #1 focus during the first 4 months of last year. And why would swipe fees be the #1 focus? Well, as Huffington Post put it, the clock never ticks down to 0 in Washington. 1 year's law is the next year's repeal target. Politicians showered with cash from card companies and giant retailers alike have been moving back and forth between camps, paid handsomely for their shifting allegiances, leading to this kind of terrifying recognition that it's the agenda itself that's also being driven by the money. We pick the issues to fight about that will flush the most money into our campaign. So why don't we get a lot of attention to unemployment? Well, it turns out that doesn't pay so well, at least in the context of campaign contributions. All right, so this is point 2. I think we can say categorically money is distorting what Congress otherwise would be doing. Not that Congress would be a genius otherwise, but it's distorting what they otherwise would be doing relative to a baseline of following what the people want. Now, you could look at that still and you say, but is that corruption? The money is guiding them to do something differently. The money is leading us not to trust them. Is that corruption? Because in this decision by the Supreme Court, which will become a 2-year-old toddler in just 3 days, on January 21st, 2012, it will turn 2, the Supreme Court set of independent expenditures, that independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or even the appearance of corruption. So when a corporation spends tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in elections, that doesn't lead people rationally, the court says, to believe that the system is corrupt because it doesn't plausibly point to quid pro quo bribery. All right, so that leads to the third point. With all due respect to the Supreme Court, that is totally wrong. You bring up my blackboard here. That's plainly corruption, what I've described. Relative to the kind of corruption the framers were obsessed about. So, the framers gave us what they said was a republic. But what they meant by a republic was a representative democracy. And as Federalist 52 describes, a representative democracy would include a branch of government that would be dependent upon the people alone. So here's their model of government. There's the people, there's the governments. I do my own slides. That's cool the way that bounces like that, right? So the people of government, sort of marionette relationship, and by securing that exclusive dependency, this institution would be the place that the public good would be found. Now, you could be skeptical about that or not, but that's the architecture for facilitating the deliberation which would make it possible for the institution to find the public good. Okay, here's the problem. Congress has evolved a different dependence in this system. Not just a dependence upon the people, but increasingly a dependence upon the funders. As they spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into the power, they develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters, as they constantly adjust how they view not issue 1 to 10, but issue 11 to 2040, so that they can assure easier access to money. Leslie Bird describes that when she went to Congress, a Democrat from Virginia, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." And to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. Now the point is, this is a dependence too. And when you think about the dependence that we have allowed to evolve within our system and compare it to what the framers were worried about, what the framers were worried about is tiny compared to what stands in the middle of our government today. We don't have a problem with foreign princes. We have a problem with domestic princes. It's the influence and dependence that we have upon domestic princes and foreign corporations that is the primary source of the corruption inside of this government, because that dependence is different and conflicted relative to the dependence upon the people alone. And that is because, surprise, surprise, the funders are not the people. So 0.26% of Americans give more than $200 in a congressional campaign. 0.05% max out in a congressional campaign. 0.01%, 1 out of 1,000, give more than $10,000 in an election cycle. So the Occupy Wall Street people are so proud of the "we are the 99%. Bad marketing, right? They are either the 99.74% or the 99.95% or the 99.99% of people who don't have the access and influence that the 0.26% or the 0.05% or the 0.01% have, because they are the ones giving the money. Now, even the Supreme Court should be able to recognize that this is corruption. It is not the corruption of cash secreted in brown paper bags. That was the problem of corruption in Congress 100 years ago. That's what the progressives were fighting. It used to be that members of Congress had safes in their office. Safes for holding cash. You might think, why did they pay members of Congress in cash? They didn't. It was just they found bags of cash on their desk and they needed a place to keep it safely, so they had safes. That problem doesn't exist anymore. Our Congress is not, in that sense, corrupt. We don't have an institution filled with Rod Blagojeviches trading personal gain for government favors. But even though we don't have that form of corruption, this is still corruption. It is a corruption relative to the baseline of a system dependent upon the people alone. It is, in this sense, dependence corruption, the development of the wrong dependence, which itself is the corruption the framers were obsessed to avoid. Okay. Okay, that is how money corrupts the system. The wrong dependency distorts the work of Congress and weakens public trust. So what's a plan for responding to it? Well, if the problem here is not a bunch of Blagojeviches, if the problem here is a system, then the solution is not to gin up the ability to prosecute a bunch of Blagojeviches. The solution is Thoreauvian. The solution is that we stop as a people hacking at these branches of evil, all the different issues that we care about, and we increasingly start to recognize the root that is making it impossible for us to achieve what we want in these issues. If there's a systemic problem here, that the funders are not the people, the systemic solution is to find a way to make the funders the people, to give them away. You know, that looks like one word. I don't mean give Congress away, although I know lots of people would like to do that. I mean give Congress a way to fund without Faust, without selling their souls and without thereby alienating America. And one way to do that, I increasingly think the only way to do that, is to openly and firmly commit to the idea of publicly funding public elections, so that we replace this large dollar funded campaign system with a system of small dollar funded campaigns. Now, 3 states have adopted systems like this: Arizona, Maine, and Connecticut. These are systems where candidates voluntarily opt into a regime where they take small dollar contributions only, and then those contributions are amplified in different ways depending on the states to make it so that they can win campaigns taking small contributions only. When Connecticut adopted this system, 78% of elected representatives opted into this system in its first year. Now, there are many ways to do that. In my book, I've described a slightly different version that responds to some criticism by conservatives. My version I call the Grant and Franklin Project. Let me explain the way it works. You first got to stipulate with me that every American gives at least $50, gives in quotes, to the federal treasury. So if every American gives $50 to the federal treasury, then under this system what we do is we rebate that first $50 in the form of a democracy voucher. And candidates can get this democracy voucher. We as citizens can give this democracy voucher to candidates, or some part of it, if those candidates voluntarily opt into funding their campaign only with democracy vouchers plus contributions limited to $100. Thus, Grant, $50, Franklin, $100. And if you as a citizen don't allocate your democracy voucher, then it gets automatically allocated to the parties, or in states like California, where most people aren't members of parties, it gets allocated to some democracy building institution, or you can allocate it as you wish. Now, the critical thing to recognize is 50 doesn't sound like a large number, but $50 per voter is $7 billion in an election cycle. 2010, the total amount raised was $1.8 billion. So this is 3 times the total amount raised in 2010, not counting any of the $100 contributions that would come in on top. And the point about that is this is real money that would make it possible for candidates to actually fund their campaigns without ever having to turn to the 0.26% or the 0.05% or the 0.01% of America that is currently funding campaigns. Now, I've for a long time thought this public funding would be enough in the system. It would be enough to achieve the kind of integrity the system needs. But as we've seen what Citizens United has inspired, I now think it's not enough. That the public funding system alone will not be enough to restore the integrity to the system because of the explosion of independent expenditures in the form of super-PAC expenditures. We've entered the age of the super-PAC, not the fun super-PAC like the Colbert super-PAC, but a very different kind of super-PAC. This is Tony Soprano, in case you don't recognize him. And we've begun to demonstrate something we could call the super-PAC dynamic. So the super-PAC dynamic was explained to me by Evan Bayh. in a panel I was on with him about a month and a half ago. He said, you've got to understand the way Washington has radically changed since Citizens United. Before Citizens United, the barons were the incumbents. They had all the power. They had the money, they had the name recognition, they were coming into an election, they probably had 60% plus in the polls. Almost nothing could dislodge them. So today, he says, that's radically different. He says the biggest thing incumbents are fearful of now is that 30 days before an election, some super PAC will come in and drop $500,000 or $1 million on the election against the incumbent and radically disrupt the plans of the incumbent. And when that happens, what does the incumbent do? Because by definition, the incumbent can't turn to his largest contributors because his largest contributors have maxed out. So he has nobody to turn to at that moment to raise the money he needs to respond to these super PAC attacks. So what he has to do is secure what we could think of as a kind of super PAC insurance. So that when the bombs get dropped from one side by a super PAC, you have some super PAC allied with you who could drop bombs from the other side and balance it out. All right. Now, how do you buy insurance? This is something we've all done, right? You buy insurance by paying your premium in advance. You can't sort of get an insurance policy, pay nothing, and then when your house burns down, pay the premium. You have to pay the premium in advance. And how do you pay a premium in advance if you're buying super PAC insurance? You behave the way the super PAC wants you to behave long before you need the protection of the super PAC. A dynamic that Tony Soprano would understand, but political scientists haven't yet gotten there. Okay, so the super PAC says something like, we'd love to help you, Senator, but we can only support people who support us at least 80% on our scorecard. So then the senator has a target which he meets so as to guarantee that when he needs the support will be there. And so without even spending $1, the super PAC achieves what the super PAC wants, which is bending the congressman to the position the super PAC is trying to buy. Now, I think what that means is that we're going to need more than just public funding. I think what this means is that we're going to need to look to Article 5 of the Constitution to facilitate an amendment. Now, it scares a lot of people to talk about an amendment, so I've put my amendment in the original font of the Constitution to encourage people. So here's Amendment 28. It's not the complete amendment, but here's the core. Congress shall have the power to limit, but not to ban, independent political expenditures within 90 days of an election. Right. What's critical here is that we are not banning, we are just limiting. So I don't believe the government should ever be in the position of being able to stop anybody from speaking about political topics, whether that's foreigners or corporations or dolphins. Everybody should be allowed to assert whatever they want to assert inside the political process. What we need to avoid is a dynamic like the super PAC dynamic, where the independent expenditures are so significant that candidates are shape-shifting not just to secure contributions, but also to avoid the wrong kind of super PAC attack. So these two things together, campaign funding through publicly funded regimes and an amendment that limits the power of super PACs, I think together would help us achieve what we might imagine to be a trustworthy Congress. Because this is the thing to think about. Imagine if we had a Congress that was elected through small dollar contributions only. Then it would be possible to believe, as we all want to believe, that when Congress did something stupid, it may have been because there are too many Republicans or maybe because there are too many Democrats, but not because of the money, because we would have removed the essential corrosive suggestion that money has in the current system, because we had replaced it with an influence of money that was not in the same way destructive, if we could achieve this. All right, so how could we ever achieve that? Because I don't actually think it's hard to see the problem here. I don't think it's actually hard to describe a solution once we see the problem here. I think what's hard here, maybe impossibly hard, is to imagine the political movement that could bring about the solution that we need. And the reason for that is the traditional people we rely upon to change policy are themselves deeply invested in the policy not changing. As Jim Cooper, a Democrat from Tennessee who's been in Congress as long as all but about 20 other members of Congress, described the problem to me. He said, the problem with Capitol Hill is that Capitol Hill has become a farm league for K Street. K Street, the place where lobbyists do their work. What he means by that is that members and staffers and bureaucrats all have an increasingly common business model as they go to work for the government. A business model focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists where they can make real money and really live the life they believe they're entitled to live. So Public Citizen found between 1998 and 2004, 50% of senators left to become lobbyists, 42% of the members of the House. Those numbers have only gone up. This is a system where everybody depends upon the system surviving. So how is it, when the only people we have to change the system depend upon the system, how is it we could ever imagine that system changing? And this suggests the challenge. How to find a way around what we should think of as a kind of cancer that now defines life inside that beltway. And this is the key. The standard way to think about politics in America is distinguished between the left and the right. Everything's left versus right. Tea Party versus Occupy. Democrats versus Republicans. Obama versus Obama. Okay, left versus right. But that's not the only interesting way to think about politics in America. Increasingly, there's an extremely important division between inside and out. Inside and out. And I think the only way we can think about bringing about the change we need here is to enable what we could call outsider politics, which is not the kind of traditional top-down politics. It's a grassroots politics. It's not the politics of politicians. It's a politics of citizens, people who don't want to become politicians, but who finally wake up as the sovereign and say, you guys have screwed it up and we've got to fix it so we can go back to sleep. It's a politics where people are not passively consuming what is fed to us by commercials, not read-only politics. It is increasingly read-write politics where we are part of the process of speaking and changing through what we create. It is an active, engaged, awoken people. This is outsider politics. And this outsider politics needs to become a kind of alliance. It has to become an alliance of diversity, diverse groups, different groups, working together in this outsider alliance. Groups of differences, right? Think alliance in this sense. Britain, United States, the Soviet Union, an alliance, not an alliance in this sense. Different souls working together, not one soul working together. Think leader like this, not leader like this. Think different, radically different characters, radically different values represented across this alliance, yet despite the differences, a reason to work together. Or for us today, think the difference between this kind of alliance, these kind of entities aligning with this type of entity. Now, in such an alliance, we don't ask the members of the alliance to compromise on their values. We don't ask them to change who they are. We didn't have to commit to the Internationale just to have an alliance with the Soviets in the context of the Second World War. We don't require that we have a common end. We don't have a common end. What we have is a common enemy. Now, they work, this alliance works then, to defeat this enemy. Now, this alliance that I'm describing between what we traditionally think of as left and right, but which I think we should think of as outsiders versus insiders, this alliance needs to do two things. It needs to commit to being cross-partisan. That has to be its character. It has to understand itself in those terms. And number two, it has to aim at the rules of the game, not at the substantive policies that distinguish the two halves of this alliance. Now, both of those requirements are impossibly hard. The discipline is impossibly hard. The cross-partisan one is difficult because the other side is the enemy, and it's fun to rally us against them. That's how we get passion to go forward. And it's hard to focus on the rules because passion is always about substance, equality, justice. That's what gets people going, not any debate about the rules. But both of these are necessary today, I think, if constitutional change is to happen. And constitutional change is the change that must happen if we are going to correct the core corruption that is destroying this republic. Now, if we formed this alliance, we would get it to push together for this change. Now, I think we have to admit we don't actually know whether it's possible to do this. We haven't done anything close to this in 100 years since the progressives peaked in 1912. But I think we do know how such a movement starts. It starts first with a certain kind of clarity. The clarity of Thoreau, the clarity of the root striker, the clarity of someone focusing on just the common ground, which I think here is this corruption. Because if we get people to think about all of the issues they care about, whether on the left or on the right, and connect the dots, so whether it's healthcare on the left or government bailouts for the right, global warming for the left or complex tax systems for the right, financial reform for the left or financial reform for the right, we would recognize in all of these problems this common root cause. And this is its picture: a system of democracy guided not by what the people want, but by what funders want. Root strikers focus us on that picture. And this alliance, too, must push together to get the people here to see it and do something about it. That's number one, clarity. Number two is a certain kind of courage. Not just a courage of the 99%, but also a certain courage for the 1%. So let me introduce you to a 1%er, Arnold Hiatt. Arnold Hiatt, a shy guy. This is the biggest picture I could find of him on the internet. He was the president of Stride Rite. They make great shoes like Keds. He's also a loyal Democrat. In 1996, he was the second largest contributor to the Democratic Party. So Bill Clinton in 1997 decided he wanted to have a dinner at the Mayflower Hotel with Arnold Hiatt and 30 other fat cats who would sit around the table and one by one stand up and tell the president what the president should do for the remaining years of his second term. We don't have any pictures of that night. I kind of imagine it like this. Arnold stands up, looks the president into his eyes and says, "Mr. President, I know you're an admirer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, so I want you to put yourself in Roosevelt's shoes in 1940. When Roosevelt reluctantly came to recognize that he needed to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Because he said, you too, Mr. President, must convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Not a war against fascists, but a war against an attitude that has been created by us fat cats. The attitude that says that merely because you're successful in the market, you're entitled to direct government policy. Merely because you are wealthy, you have the right to get the president on the other end of the phone. An attitude which has produced the attitude in America that democracy doesn't work because government is bought." Now, I want you to think about the courage such an act takes. To be surrounded by your 30 fat cat friends and to tell the president that the problem in America, the threat to democracy is us. After he spoke, there was a certain silence in the room. The only published account we have of the evening said, Clinton's response effectively slashed Hiatt to pieces, humiliating him in front of the group. Now, 15 years later, we need to recognize that it was Arnold Hiatt who was right. We do need to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. But where Arnold Hiatt was wrong was in his belief that it would be politicians who would wage that war. It's not politicians, it's citizens. It's us, it's root strikers. I hope it's you. It's our job, it takes our courage, because it's our republic that has been lost, ours not theirs. They took it away, and we let them. I'm sure many know the story of Franklin being carried from the Constitutional Convention in September 1787, stopped on the street by a woman who said, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" Franklin responds, "A republic, madame, if you can keep it. A republic, a representative democracy, a government dependent upon the people alone. We have lost that republic, and all of us have to act to get it back." Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions. Yes, sir.